I'd like to thank you for joining the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience and the Australian Red Cross with our disaster recovery mentors for the first in our new webinar series, Recovery Uncovered. I'm Erin Pelly and I'm the National Manager for Recovery at Red Cross, and I'm so excited to be hosting you all today. I'd like to pay my respects to the First Nations people joining us today. I'm hosting this webinar from Naarm on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the people on the lands with which you are all joining us today. I'd like to pay my respects to all Aboriginal people on the call, elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to just acknowledge the deep history and culture Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have around healing and caring for country in Australia. I'd like to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So today we will be recording this session. There is a Q&A function down the bottom of your screen. We will be hosting a Q&A session at the end of this hour, so at 2 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time, and there'll be a separate Zoom link provided a bit later, which all you have to do is click. I think it's in the chat now, and you can vote up questions that you'd like to be answered using the thumbs up button through the Q&A feature, not the chat. Also, please use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentation. But just a reminder, we're all here to learn and all at different stages after a disaster. So please be kind with your comments and questions for each other and our presenters today. Thank you. Disaster Recovery Mentors is a mentoring program coordinated by the Australian Red Cross. It's aimed at supporting disaster-affected communities, their leaders and practitioners who support them in recovery. We aim to support community-led recovery through this initiative. The Recovery Uncovered webinar series has been designed to provide recovery workers, practitioners and communities with insights into disaster recovery from a community perspective. They will share disaster recovery lessons from emergency management and the disaster resilience sector, using a combination of lived experience, storytelling, presented by our fabulous disaster recovery mentors, and this will be complemented by research, practical advice, and information presented by experts. Our first inaugural webinar, Introduction to Community Disaster Recovery, will provide you with an overview of two of our mentors, Anne Leadbeater and Dr. Kate Brady. I'll just introduce them to you and you'll see them come up on screen. So Anne Leadbeater has over 25 years of experience in community and economic development through roles in local, state government, emergency management and adult education. Anne's worked on behalf of the Murrindindi Shire Council to coordinate recovery efforts for the Kinglake Ranges after the 2009 Victorian bushfires, and has worked with disaster impacted communities all over Australia, including Queensland, New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria and New Zealand. Welcome, Kate. Dr. Kate Brady has a distinguished career in disaster recovery operations, programming and research. Kate is a Senior Research Fellow at the University of New South Wales on their How We Survive initiative. She's an Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne and is the Technical Advisor to Australian Red Cross, where she's established and led the disaster recovery program for 12 years. Her work mostly focuses on what people find helpful and unhelpful after disasters. And in 2021, she became the host for the ABC's After the Disaster podcast, which you should all check out. Welcome, Kate, and welcome, Anne. Really pleased to have you today. And I guess to start us off, I'm pretty keen for you to tell me, what are we even talking about when we say, let's start at what's a community?
So Kate and I thought that we would depart a little bit from the usual today, in the sense that normally when we talk about recovery, we think very much about the disaster and the disaster's impacts. But we thought we might actually just go back right to the source of a lot of the challenges and opportunities that we encounter in disaster recovery by looking at what our actual concept of community is. And do we spend enough time really thinking about that in terms of how we understand the work of recovery and the way that we interact with community. So the reality is that every community is different, and we don't need to explain that in great detail. It's pretty obvious, but it's important for us to note that there are common characteristics, there are common experiences, particularly in relation to disaster, but it's really, you're going to get off on a very bad foot if you say, oh, this community is just like the community up the road, because in actual fact, they will be unique. And importantly, people will self-identify as to whether or not they are part of a community. We don't have to spend a lot of time deciding whether someone is in or out of a community, because they themselves will know. The community, we can think about communities in terms of their geography, and that's a common way that we understand communities after a disaster particularly. So that geographical location-based understanding. But we also need to consider that communities can be identified by shared interests, a common purpose, or in the case of post-disaster, by impact. So the people in the community that were directly affected by a disaster are the ones who were indirectly affected, those people who were not affected in any way in particular. So we've got lots of different ways that we need to consider this concept. And if that wasn't complicated enough, then there are multiple communities within each community. So we have neighbourhoods, we have networks, we have virtual communities. And so we can start to get a sense of just the multifaceted complexity that we're dealing with when we say the community. Now, what we know is that communities have enormous strengths and capabilities, and some of them also have some significant vulnerabilities, particularly in relation to their risk of disaster and the impacts that a disaster might have. Communities commonly will have, of course, great people. They will have leaders, elders, respected elders and leaders who they recognise and who they understand and who make sense to them. Usually communities have a communication system. So whether it's the land care community, for example, or whether it's community who are linked by a common purpose or a common interest, the needlework tool collectors of Australia, there's usually some way that those people stay in touch. And at the sort of geographical level, very often that will be community Facebook pages, local papers, newsletters, that sort of thing. So communities are a system of social structure, and they provide security. They help us divide labour in a sensible way. Not everyone has to do every single job in a community. It's actually better if people have different jobs, and together their common contribution actually is what makes the community work. Importantly, communities will have a sense of history. They'll have a culture and they'll have traditions, and inevitably they are passionately invested in their own future and their own sense of self. So when we think about the concept of community, we need to understand that there are different types of communities, and that most of us will participate across a number of different communities within our lives, both where we live, but also where we work, who we recreate with. Do we play netball? Do we play cricket? Are we a member of the arts community? And what is it that we do with our lives? School communities are really, clear way to understand how people can group together around a common interest. So we really need to attend to this complexity and to understand very much what the likely impact on all of those relationships is likely to be after a disaster. There's diversity within communities. So we have every type of diversity represented. And also we have transient populations, so people move in and out of community as well. I think it's fair to say that we're in a time where we're seeing potentially lowered community participation in lots of areas around Australia, and we're also experiencing a lack of people contact. So we're connecting virtually, we're connecting, like we are today, across different digital mediums, but we're perhaps not spending as much time directly interacting with people as we have perhaps in the past. So we use communities to help us identify our role and the way that we function on a daily basis. Our part in the community helps us to guide our day-to-day activities. And this occurs on both a conscious level. I'm the school crossing supervisor, and that is my role in the community. That's what I do. And it also happens on an unconscious level. So that sort of subconscious awareness of who you would go through, how you would access help if you needed it, how you would offer help if you needed to. Those are the things that kind of wrap around us when we think about community. So one of the things that we commonly see with the post-disaster setting is assumptions being made that because people have all been impacted by a common event, that they're going to be part of a homogenous group. Okay, this is community X and they've had a cyclone, so therefore they are all the same. But that's a really flawed understanding, and it gets us off on a really bad footing, because we really need to understand that this is community X and all of this complexity exists there. And so if we want to understand the impact of the disaster, we need to understand it through that complex, multifaceted lens, and not try and simplify this as being one group of people, one disaster event, one common response.
And I'm very impressed at how well behaved you're being. We did say at the beginning of this that we weren't going to be proper recovery workers talking about proper recovery things. So good start. I was going to jump in there and add a couple of comments. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to challenge Anne Leadbeater on anything to do with communities or community engagement, but what I wanted to add was just from a recovery worker's perspective about how challenging this can be. I mean, I think we can all have a really good understanding of this, a really sensible understanding of this. And then when we think, well, how do we put it in practice? It's really hard. It can be really, really difficult. Not the least because I think a lot of geographic boundaries. So, a lot of emergency management plans, a lot of roles are set up by geographic boundaries, but that's not how we live as people, is it? So Anne sort of said something at the beginning that I really want to reinforce, because I think it's gold. And if we can't think about it in these terms, we really get caught up. That one of the ways that we can think about how we're defining communities, understanding there is a complexity and multiplicity of communities within communities. But if we think about them either being geographically based, communities of interest, and communities of impact when it comes to disasters. And all three of those are major categories sitting over all the different subgroups within them. Very few of them are geographically bound. Even some of the geographical ones don't fit our geographical boundaries, because suburbs cross LGAs, LGAs cross regions, there are different ways that we cut pies. And so that can be a really, really challenging thing to get our head around. But I think what we do need to remember as recovery workers is it's our problem. Like, it's not the people that we're serving's problem, it is our problem. So if our service can't cross a geographic boundary, but we're supposed to be serving a particular community or communities, we've got to figure out how to solve that geographic boundary issue. It's not up to them. If we're thinking about how we are sort of categorizing or breaking down groups, quite often with this attempt, and we'll get more into community-led recovery, but quite often in this attempt to, implement community-led recovery, we'll say, well, it's the community's decision, but we'll only allow one group or one spokesperson to be that community representative or group of representatives. And that forces conflict, right? Like, by definition, that sort of thing forces conflict. But what I did want to say as a heartening note, I suppose, is that if you are based in the geographic community, or you are part of the community of interest that you're serving, you're probably going to have a good lay of the land as long as you can recognize your own biases. But a lot of us are people who come in from the outside, whether it is outside that community of interest, outside that community of impact, outside that geographic community, to come in to help. And so often there's this real pressure for us to define the community and find the community really, really fast. And if, you know, there's anything that I've learned, and I know, like, and I've obviously learned from Anne and many, many other people, is trying to take a breather, trying to take that slowly, trying to get a good sense of what that community was like before you got there, before a disaster happened, before a major disruption happened. And those things that Anne's talking about in terms of communication channels within communities, I mean, there is a formal term for it, or lots of formal terms for it. One is asset-based community development, and that can feel like a really overwhelming thing to know about. Do I know about asset-based community development? What if I'm not trained in asset-based community development? It is, in some ways, the most simple and most heartening tool that you have in your toolkit. All it means is try and figure out what was there and how you fit into that, rather than creating something new or creating these new communities within communities. And instead looking at what was there, how you can fit in, how you can serve that, and what work you're going to have to do behind the scenes to be able to cross those geographic boundaries, or those different sort of rules or restrictions that you might have in place.
I think, Kate, one of the most useful ways to approach this part of the whole discussion, I guess, is with humility. You know, you don't have to know everything. You don't have to be the expert about the community, because the community has its own expertise. You just have to be willing to listen to and learn from the community and tap into their expertise. Being comfortable in not having all the answers is probably one of the key skills.
Messiness, like,
yeah.
If I have someone that comes to me and says, well, I know exactly who the community I'm working with, and I know them, I know what they want, and I think, oh gosh, like, wow, I'm a bit worried, because if anything is that clear cut, maybe there's a whole bunch of information missing. Like, it is messy and it's complicated and it changes, it's dynamic. But you don't have to invent it. It's there.
Absolutely.
So, Erin, aren't we being well behaved?
So good. There was even a pause. I guess, you know, you're talking about the complexities of this stuff, and I agree with particularly what you were just saying, Anne, around, you know, being humble. And I know I've had some pretty amazing people, it might have been one of you at some point, asking and then ask again, and then making sure you listen. So I guess on asking questions, what is a disaster? What's recovery? And really, do we know all that we're talking about the same thing when we talk about a disaster or disaster recovery?
Yeah, we thought. Thank you, Erin. Excellent segue. We thought that we would bring this up because we thought if we started with community and then went into this disaster context, it would be helpful. And I suppose most people who have been working in this for a little while probably have their heads around it, but we know so many people in the disaster or recovery workforce, whether it's paid or voluntary, kind of get chucked into it and have to figure things out as they go, and often never have time to access a lot of the resources that are out there. So we just want to run through this really quickly. In terms of what is a disaster, I mean, sometimes that can seem really obvious and other times not so much. And it's kind of worth noting, particularly if you're new to the area, that there's about 50 years worth of debate, 50, 60 years worth of debate, where a lot of people debated for a very long time about exactly what is a disaster and when it is a crisis and when's it an emergency and when's it a calamity. But basically, there's three really broad schools of thinking about it. The first is that the disaster is the hazard event. So a disaster is a cyclone, a disaster is a bushfire, a disaster is a flood, a disaster is a tsunami, whatever. The second school of thought is a disaster is when a hazard intersects with the population, or threatens to intersect with the population. So a bushfire out and by itself may not be a disaster, but a bushfire when impacting a population or threatening a population becomes a disaster. And the third school of thought is one that really became much more prominent after Hurricane Katrina. And some people agree with it, some people don't, but it's around the idea that the disaster are the social conditions that are happening in life, and that a hazard event is what shines light on it. And so in this case, in the case of, say, Hurricane Katrina, a lot of that discussion was really around the idea of the disaster is poverty, or the disaster is racial injustice, or the disaster is, inequity. And the hurricane showed us that. So the hurricane merely was a spotlight in it. Now, these three things are all interlinked, but they're quite distinct in their perspectives. And it's really important that you know where you sit in it, so that when you're talking to other people, you can see where there might be differences in your assumptions that you're making. But even more so with recovery. So recovery is one of these sort of funny things that doesn't actually get defined very often. And I personally think maybe the reason is because we have 50 years of debate about what a disaster was, and everyone was like, we can't go back there, don't want to do that. In Australia, if you look at the official definitions, like if you look at the Emergency Management Australia glossary, I believe it hasn't been updated still, that the definition says something like disaster recovery is the coordinated efforts of blah, 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 where we do these things and we do it to support people who have been affected by disasters. I should really have the official definition in front of me, but I don't think that much of it, so I don't. So that's sort of, if we think about that as sort of an activity type of definition. The second type of definition is really around restoration definition. So we'll build back, or we'll build back better. So like restoration plus. But the idea that we'll know we're recovered when things have gone back to what they used to be, or they look quite similar to what they used to be, maybe enhanced a little bit. And then the third definition of it really sits around change. And so the idea that recovery is, and Block here is, I know you don't like this term, is living a new normal, or it's when we are future focused. So we're forward looking, we're not looking back at when the disaster happened or our old life, we're future focused towards what our new life is, even if it doesn't look anything like what our old life was. Now, with those three definitions, with that, I was a bit dismissive of that definition of recovery is the coordinated activity stuff. It is really important, but that's what recovery management is. So that places recovery managers at the center, it places organizations at the center, it doesn't place communities or affected people at the center. So just park that to the side and call that recovery management, and it sits quite nicely over there. And so then we have these other two definitions, this restoration definition and this change definition. And I don't think there is a right definition. I think it's a dynamic scale, and people move back and forward at different times beyond whether they're trying to get back to how things were or trying to get to something different. And that's for a whole host of different reasons. But the reason that I bring it up, and I think it's really important for us to talk about, is we're aiming for different things there. And if we don't have those conversations about when we say recovery, what we mean is, or we think when we are recovered, it will look and feel like this, we might be working at cross purposes. We might be looking for different things. So if you've got someone, if we think about for a family unit, for example, one person in a family who's like, we'll know we're recovered when the exact same house is rebuilt in the exact same spot, and our kids are going to the exact same school that they were, and they're going to footy and doing piano lessons, and we're eating the same sort of food that we used to eat before, that we have purchased from the same supermarket that we used to purchase it from before. And the other person in the house is saying, I can't live here anymore. I don't want to live here anymore. I can't stand this. Like, I'm never going to be able to feel settled or safe while we're living here. This has really shaken up everything that I sort of held true, or this has really changed my perspective on my values or what I'm aiming for. So no, I'm definitely not living back here. Recovery, that would be going back to something quite bad. Recovery for me will look like my life has changed and I've moved into the future. So if we extrapolate that from individual and household level, and then we go out into communities, and then we go out into big service systems, if we're not having that conversation about, is recovery restoration, or is recovery change, or is it somewhere in the middle, then we might be aiming for completely different things in our actions, but we never talk about it. So that's why we thought about was important to bring this up at the beginning. And I know you sit at one end of this spectrum, and that other people sit at the other end, but there is a diversity of views in this.
There is. Never have so many worked to achieve a single outcome with so little clarity about what the outcome actually is. I work in recovery. Do you? What does that actually mean? Great question. And so
I get sent a lot of prosthetic and IT ads. So there's all different definitions of
that. That's right. And the thing You know, for my purposes, I guess over the years, in trying to really pare this back to the human experience, I have come to regard the impact of a disaster as a loss of control over your life. And sometimes that loss of control happens very, very suddenly. Sometimes it happens over weeks, or sometimes even, you know, multiple weeks and even into months. If you think about a slow burning campaign fire that might threaten you for weeks on end. But however it happens, that sense of losing control over what you formerly had control of is really the sort of the kind of human experience of disaster. And so therefore, for me, the work of recovery is actually helping people to regain control of their lives, to get back in the driver's seat of their own lives, to be able to make decisions, to make choices, to advocate for what they need, with the ultimate aim to be able to once again live a life that they have reason to value. And it might be, you know, a life that's very similar to their previous life. It might be a life that's very, very different. It might be in the same location, a different location. But the important thing is that that individual has a reason to value the life that they are then living. Now, that's, you know, a very kind of fundamental way of looking at this. But I can't agree more with Kate to say, you know, in whatever capacity you're working in recovery, you do need to get some clarity around what it is you're trying to achieve, and what it is that you are working towards on behalf of the people who've been affected. Because without that sense of clarity, shock horror, there is more than one agenda in disaster recovery. You know, sometimes there are multiple agendas and they are diametrically opposed, and they're not all coming from the community. So it really is important to be clear in your own mind about
Or
what
they
it
can
is.
be coming from the community
Yeah,
and
that's
don't
exactly right. Yeah, absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
not like there is one single truth in any of this, right? And I think, you know, just on the what is a disaster thing, I think it's fair to say, and I've known each other for a long time now, we're quite hazard agnostic, aren't we? We are all the things all the time. If it's a big disruption and takes something out of control, it doesn't matter if it's on a hazards list. We know that some people have stronger views than others on that.
Yeah, that's right. I think the thing is that sense of loss of control. I mean, we can see it happen in lots of different ways for lots of different reasons and in response to lots of different stresses and traumas. So, yes, you know, there's a lot of conversation around, you know, natural disasters and natural hazards and all of that sort of stuff. But really, if a bad thing happens, and it really doesn't really matter what kind of bad thing it is, then the aftermath of that is what I guess we're talking about in terms of trying to support people's recovery. Yeah.
Yeah, so if a bad thing happens and you're trying to help people deal with the bad thing happens, communities being complex, disasters being complex, what is it then that we actually mean when we talk about community-led recovery and how you bring the two together?
So, you know, just that one very simple answer, like it's just there. So we're going to take a two-parter on this, we've decided. So the first part is I'm going to talk a little bit about the Australian policy context. And I can see from the chat that's been popping up that we've got some friends from New Zealand and some friends from Canada on the line. And Canada, my goodness, it must be very early in the morning for you. So thank you for joining us. But I'm going to give us a bit of a policy context, and then Anne's going to talk us through some of the deeper considerations. The first thing is to note that community-led recovery is a recovery principle in Australia, one of the 6 recovery principles in Australia that every single jurisdiction has agreed to. They've signed off on it and they've agreed to it. And this isn't a recent thing. This didn't happen in the 80s, somewhere in the 80s. So for context, I was born in the 80s and I'm in my 40s now. So, you know, like it's been around for a long time. These principles have been around for a long time. Very recently, I had the dubious pleasure of doing a policy analysis of every state and territory jurisdiction in relation to how they describe community-led recovery. And I don't think it will be that surprising to most people who work in the sector to know that, one, it is not defined consistently anywhere. What community-led recovery is, it's sort of talked around and it's kind of described a little bit, but it's not defined anywhere, and it's certainly not defined consistently. But the second thing is that there is absolutely no guidance within policy around how it happens. And the reason that I suppose, raise this is because it's really hard if you start working in this and you're like, well, I've got to get my head across it. I'll flick to my jurisdiction's rules and I'll have a look at it. you're not going to find an answer there. And so this is a really challenging piece for a lot of us, because if this is something that every single jurisdiction has agreed to, we agree it's a fundamental foundational underpinning of the way that we're going to work, but we don't exactly know what it means and we're not sure how to do it. We haven't agreed how to do it. That makes it really, really hard. To throw a little bit of a plug here, I've got myself and some colleagues at the University of Melbourne are currently doing some research on how to define this and some guidance around it. And so a call out will come out for that very soon, I'm sure. But Anne, you live and breathe this stuff, and you are the person who teaches most of us about this. What are some things that we need to think about when we're thinking about community-led recovery?
Yeah, so it sort of rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Community-led recovery. It's like world peace. You know, who is going to argue about the fact that communities should be able to lead their own recovery? Only a very brave person. But we have this inherent tension when we have legislative responsibilities to do certain things in response to disasters. How do we let the community lead when the legislation says that we need to do X, Y, and Z and make sure that it happens in, you know, X time frame? So we're kind of we're really hitting the wall before we're even out of the blocks. You know, we're struggling with this tension. Why would we want to support you know, communities to lead their own recovery? Well, first of all, you know, it just makes sense that communities know what they need. And the fastest way to replicate what was already happening in the community before the disaster is to let the community lead you to that place and let you understand what the community looked like, how it operated, you know, what its networks and connections and what its strengths and vulnerabilities actually meant for it. Communities have local knowledge, experience and expertise, and they can mobilise capacity within themselves better than any other agency or any government can do. So that is a real strength in supporting this idea of community-led. There's what I like to call the inherent wisdom of communities. And that's that thing that, you know, when you're in the meeting and you say, why don't we do this? And a few learned local people will shake their head and say, no, that's not going to work. And they just know. And sometimes they can't even articulate why they know, but they just know. So tapping into that inherent wisdom of community helps us to be able to target our recovery efforts in ways that are going to be most effective. It'll also help us to get in touch with the very genuine priorities and aspirations of the community. So we won't end up building useless edifices to recovery. We'll actually invest our money wisely and our efforts wisely in things that the community itself will actually use and value. And finally, you know, if we go back to being able to support people to be getting back into control of their lives, then community-led recovery, that ability to be self-determining is so important. And I have to say, you know, it came as a huge shock to me after the Black Saturday bushfires back in 2009, how hard as a community we had to advocate to be able to influence the decisions that were going to affect us. It was a shock. You know, surely they would just ask us. Actually, no, they're not going to ask. They're going to do all of these things and make all of these decisions in the absence of that local expertise and input. So there is a lot to recommend this concept. There is, however, what I like to think of as the dark art of community-led recovery, the sort of the counter perspective. And that is equally important to consider and to understand. Now, we've already talked about the complexity of community, and given that complexity, how do we know when something is genuinely being led by the community? Who do we listen to? Do we listen to the loudest voices? Do we listen to the usual suspects? Like, how do we actually get a sense of who in the community should be doing this leading? And how on earth do we reach a consensus in the community when that's hard enough to do, you know, when everything's going well? And it's incredibly difficult to try and achieve when you've got people who've been impacted by a traumatic event. The reality after a disaster is that the people who are least affected will be most able to engage in your process. So the ones who have experienced the least effect of the disaster will have the most capacity to come to the meetings, to fill out the surveys, to, tell you what they think. And the people who've been most profoundly affected will have the least capacity. So if you're not careful in the way that you manage that, a few months down the track, you'll have a whole lot of people who might be really happy with what you've decided to support, and a whole lot of other people who are just coming out of the fog of disaster who are really shocked to discover what their community now looks like. And you may well have been responsible for defining that community by its disaster rather than by all of its aspirations and priorities that existed before. There are, on occasion, priorities that get put forward, sometimes by small vocal minorities in communities, sometimes by people even outside of communities, that are then represented as genuine community priorities. And there's a great risk that this can occur. I know this place and what they really want is X. As Kate said, beware people coming to you in absolute certainty about this stuff, because there's likely to be a variety of views. And even worse, there have been examples of responsibility shifting and blame being apportioned to community. Well, that was a stupid idea, but the community said they wanted it, that sort of stuff. So this very noble concept can be used for nefarious purposes as well. And we have to really be very careful in the way that we consider and very genuine in the way that we represent this idea of community-led. So for that reason, in recent years, I've been advocating for a bit of a different way to think about this, and that is considering community continuity. So thinking about a priority or an aspiration for recovery as being supporting community continuity in the way that we support business continuity after a disaster that's befallen a business or organisation. So focusing on what was happening before and how we can support communities being able to get back into business of living their lives and interacting as a community. Again, allowing for new priorities and new things that will emerge as a consequence of the disaster.
Wow.
There's just two more things that Anne and I had a chance to talk about that I wanted to sort of raise in that. The first is just that idea of fatigue and time management. So sometimes I've got a colleague who refers to it as the fast slow, this idea that some actions need to happen really fast and some actions need to happen really slow, and that this intense sense of fatigue and the burden of all the things that need to happen after disasters does make community-driven or community-led responses sometimes very, very challenging. There is so much work to happen. But one of the things I wanted to draw on just as a consideration is I think there's a real range of ways that different recovery practitioners view what their role is in community-led processes. And there are some people who go to one extreme. We send out a survey, we use the survey for the next survey results for the next 3 or 4 years. It doesn't matter that only 10 people completed the survey. We asked, they said, we did, we did community-led recovery. And then at the very, very extreme other end, I think it's very easy to sort of we laugh at those people and we pick on those people a little bit, but it's very few people and they're trying their best. They really are usually very under-resourced and they're trying their absolute best. But down at the other end, we have this group as well that I don't think we talk about as often, and they're sometimes what I refer to as the purists. So this idea that absolutely nothing can be done unless it is community instigated. And that includes not raising any suggestions or not predicting any reasonable needs or not drawing on examples from other communities for fear that it will somehow pollute a pure community-led process. And I just want to warn against that too, because I think as recovery workers or people working in different facets of this, we also have a responsibility at a time where there is great upheaval, there is great disturbance, there is great levels of fatigue, and there is so much confusion sometimes. There's a lot of work to do to be able to say, here are things that it would seem are reasonably predictable and are very common after events where support will be needed. Does this sound about right? Like making suggestions and things like that, not waiting for everything to come to you. And I suppose using the privilege that you have of being someone who is either not as overwhelmed, some people will be as overwhelmed, they'll be personally affected as well as trying to run these roles, or having access to other resources that people might not have, being able to say, we can draw these together and use them to help. That doesn't mean that you're thwarting a community-led process by being able to predict sensible, reasonable needs.
Right, so there's community's complex, recovery's really hard. We're trying to look at community continuity while everyone's tired. They might be personally impacted themselves. I know when I first came into this stuff, I was like, what on earth is everyone talking about? I felt like it took me 6 months before I could spell recovery in and amongst all the chaos that was going on around. So what is it then? How do you find that balance between not kind of doing too and not getting kind of caught up in the roundabout circles and kind of inertia? So for, you know, people on the call trying to work out what are we supposed to do in this, and there's massive consequences. What's their job? What's a recovery worker's job then?
It's a really, really, really hard job that you probably haven't received any training in, that you probably got thrown into, that you may have got thrown into unwillingly, that you probably have an insecure contract for, and that is you're trying to learn as you go with a billion things to be doing. Now, I'm going to throw to Anne in just a second, but both Anne and I came across it at about the same time. It was probably courtesy of Lou Mitchell, I'm guessing, who introduced us to this woman, Stephanie Roy McCallum, who's from Canada. But Anne and I both had an opportunity to see this, and we both had, I think it's fair to say, a very visceral reaction when we saw this image. It wasn't this exact image, we recreated it for this. But Elise, can we have the brick slide up, please? Thank you. So this is my very technical representation of this. This is something that gets referred to sometimes as the chaotic path. Now, my understanding is since I first saw it, the chaotic path has been theorized and now it's represented in these much swisher circles. But the first time I saw it, it looked something like this. And I had one of those moments where I was like in a room gasping, like I had my hand over my mouth going, that is my job. Oh my gosh, that's my job. And it's this idea that on the one side, if you're working with communities in disaster affected communities, on the one side, there is this rigidity and order and structure and rules and legislations and guidelines. They don't all intersect neatly like a brick wall, like they quite often contradict each other, but there is rigidity there. There is the firmness there. There is an immovability there in lots of ways. There are things that you just have to go through because you can't shift them yourself. And then on the other side, you've got what from the outside looks like chaos. It's not chaos, but from the outside, it kind of looks like chaos. It's very loose, it's very fluid, it's very dynamic. There are many, many, many things at play that are overlapping and intersecting each other. And then in the middle, you sort of have this like browny yellow line in the middle. That's your job. Your job is to walk that. Your job is to figure out how to make the structure talk to that perceived chaos and to make the perceived chaos fit within that structure. And you'll go back and forward and back and forward and back and forward in it. And one of the, I think, things about this is it feels incredibly lonely because it can feel like you don't fit on either side. You don't fit on this super structured, super rigid, super ordered side, and you don't fit in this very fluid, very dynamic side. You have to sort of negotiate between the two completely. And I'll throw over to you because I know you have a lot of views on this.
Yeah, well, similarly, Kate, that chaotic path idea made such sense to me the first time I saw it as well. And I think the reality is that neither of those sides of the path are wrong. They both exist for a purpose. And not everything in the chaos is bad. You know, sometimes out of that chaos comes great innovation and collaboration and new ways of working, new ways of understanding, new ways of challenging some of the bricks in the wall. So we shouldn't be fearful of either side, but we do need to know that that finding that pathway through and making those two diverse and diametrically opposed sort of systems work together is really the work of recovery. And that's not comforting, because it's, that's an incredibly challenging thing. And would that it was only those two sort of environments, but then you've also got politics and policy and history and, divergent views as well. So it is the most complex environment that I have ever worked in. And I think that is why we have to be continually learning. Every time I go to a disaster impacted community, I learn new things. Every time I do a training session with community recovery practitioners, I learn new things. I learn new ways of both appreciating the challenges, but also trying to identify, potential solutions. I remember, discovering, to my great relief, I guess, having been sort of thrust into a recovery role, that my community development background was really useful, because I was used to not telling communities what to do. I was used to asking them what they thought. And so in my very early raw and formative days after the bushfires in 2009, it was very much about, so what are we going to do today? It was really about that kind of journey of discovery. And I learned that relating to people in that way actually is empowering for people who've been affected by disaster, the fact that they know that they can contribute and have a say. So that idea of never doing to or doing for when you can do with, I think is a really powerful way to understand finding your way on that path, and ideally helping others to find their way as well. And another thing I once learnt from a group of recovery practitioners in South Australia, we were having a conversation about the transition, from what about when recovery is over, and how do you sort of back away gracefully and not leave a big gap? And one of the people in the class said, well, it seems to me if you never take something off the community, you'll never have to try and give it back to them. And I remember thinking that was a really useful insight. It's like, rather than saying, right, well, we're here now, we'll do all of this for you, you won't have to worry about it. At some point, you're going to want to stop doing it for the community. You're going to want them to do it for themselves. And that kind of handing back that responsibility can be quite challenging. So rather than taking it over in the first place, actually walking alongside the community and helping them to continue to do the things they were great at before seems to me to be a much better approach to being able to be an effective recovery practitioner.
Wow, I've never heard it said, if you don't take something off the community, no, then you don't have to give it back to them. I've never heard it said like that, but
well, neither had I, and it was we stopped, it's like, whoa, that is such an important observation. And again, it came from someone who was doing the work, and that was their observation, which was so powerful. The community didn't need us to do this thing for them before the disaster. They probably, given a little bit of time, won't need us to do it for them during recovery. They might need some support to continue to do it well, but we don't have to ride in on our white chargers and say, right, down tools, we're here now. It's much better to come in quietly and respectfully and look at those things that need some assistance, those things that need some support, some signposts for the chaotic path, rather than just assuming that our kind of expert knowledge is going to trump the local community experience and their own knowledge about themselves.
Yeah. And I'm just mindful of time in and amongst all the chaos and complexities. So I guess for both of you, before we go into the Q&A, what's one piece of advice, or two pieces if you keep it succinct, for somebody starting in recovery in week one?
Did you want to go first then?
No, I think you go first, Kate. I think You go first.
So on my first day of working in disaster recovery, I was sort of being looked after by our then operations manager. I was at Red Cross. This woman no longer works there. Her name's Jen Walsh. And she was an incredibly experienced emergency manager. And she sort of, because she was an operations manager, she had like a clipboard, and she also had one of, like, I think she still wore a pager at the time. Like, I might be exaggerating that in my head, but like, you get the vibe. Like, this is a woman who was prepared and she knew what she was doing. And she's like, here's how you get a car and how you sign the keys out, and here's the thing that you need to sign for this, and here's how you log into this, and here's how you access this. Also, and she's got a clipboard, and she says, are you a professional or a martyr? And I was like, sorry, excuse me? And she said, a professional or a martyr. And, I was on my first day of the job. I didn't want to look like a complete idiot. I'm already like really stressed knowing that I'm never going to sign the car keys out properly, because it's just not the sort of person I am. I get yelled at very frequently for this. So I'm like trying to minimize the amount of things that I'm going to get in trouble for. And I sort of looked very confused, and she said, I don't really mind which one you are. I just need to know so I know how to use you. Like, if you're a martyr, I'm definitely going to have time for you. Like, martyrs turn up to every shift they get given. They never go home on time. They never say, no, Jen, I can't do this today because I have something on that's important in my life, or I'm not feeling very well right now. They always, always, always turn up, and you'll be great. I'll definitely get to use you. But you know what? We churn and burn martyrs because they have no boundaries. They don't know when to say no. So I just need to know, because I probably won't invest in you very much. There won't be a lot of professional development for you because you're not going to be around for a long time. You'll be great while you're here, but you won't be around for a long time. But if you're a professional, you'll probably be a pain in my ass, actually, like, because you'll say sometimes, no, Jen, I don't think I can do that right now, or I need extra help to do that, or if you want me to do that, I'm going to have to drop this and put this thing down. And it's going to be really annoying, but I'll invest in you because you'll be around for a long time. And so I used to tell that story when I was working with New Zealand Red Cross a bit, and they took it a step further. This is after the Canterbury earthquakes, and what they found from their observations of their teams was this idea of, actually, it could be not just a martyr, it could also be a robot. And then we had all these complicated theories about, like, maybe a robot is a martyr that went too far and got pushed too far. But these people who can't engage with empathy because it's too hard for them. They've been hurt themselves in some way, or they've been exhausted in some way, and now they don't have that capacity for empathy anymore. But at the other end, you've got the martyr who is over empathetic but has absolutely no boundaries. And somewhere in the middle is that sweet spot. And it's really, 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 really hard to maintain that sweet spot because it's not a static spot. It moves, the line moves all the time, and you move all the time. You're a dynamic person, and what's going on for you moves all the time. And so these are very, very, very long story to say, my advice to recovery workers in week 1 is book leave. It's your first week. Block it out in your calendar now, because you are not going to do it when you get there, and you are going to be so tired. And by the time you go on leave, when you're that fatigued, 1, it's not a holiday anymore. These basic recuperation. But 2, you will have burnt yourself out in that period before you take the leave. So before you hit the road on your first day, open up your calendar and block chunks of leave. Block it now so things can't get put in there. That's my advice. Anne?
Yes, I love that story, Kate. And the thing that I would just say is to reiterate that idea that you don't have to have all the answers. Community expertise and experience and insights exist. You don't have to have them when you turn up. You just need to be prepared to ask lots of questions and to genuinely listen and be guided by what you hear. And if in doubt, if you really are not sure how to proceed, then work in a way that you would want to be worked with. If this was your community, if this was your family who'd been impacted by a disaster, and if you do that, then genuinely you won't go too far wrong.
Wow, I could sit here and listen to you guys for another hour. Thanks for sharing some hard-won wisdom. I know it was hard one. So 2 things: work with people how you'd like to be worked with, and book leave. I love that. Here's an excuse for a holiday. Yes. I think we've just put in the chat the link to the session for the Q&A. So just so everybody knows, it's up on the screen here if you want to write it in, but it's also in the chat with the link. We'll probably need to, it'll probably be a 2-minute mad scramble as you kind of go off into the ether. But thank you so much for coming and listening to us all today. We will be continuing the Q&A on the other link in the chat for the next 30 minutes. Really massive thank you, Anne and Kate, for sharing all your pearls of wisdom. I continue to learn stuff from you each time. So thank you all, and thank you everyone else for coming along.